All right, so today we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly often overlooked chapter of history, Spanish Alaska.
Hmm.
And what's so cool is you've brought us a really interesting collection of sources for this deep dive. We've
Yeah.
got interview excerpts, a YouTube video transcript, and what seems like an entire podcast episode,
Right.
all focused on this period.
Yeah.
So today, our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to uncover why this particular slice of history matters.
Definitely.
And not just as like a weird little footnote,
Totally.
but for what it reveals about global power dynamics way back then.
Yeah.
And how it shapes our understanding of the Pacific Northwest even today.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited. What about you?
Oh, I'm totally with you. It's really captivating, actually, how these sources kind of offer these different lenses on the whole Spanish-Alaska thing.
I know.
We've got, like, firsthand accounts from those explorers themselves. We've got, geopolitical analysis of the whole era. We even get glimpses into the daily lives of the people who were, brave enough to actually venture into this totally unknown territory.
Yeah, it's like we're piecing together this historical puzzle.
Exactly.
And what's so interesting is that it's not a simple, Spain went to Alaska story.
Not at all. It really challenges those typical history book narratives and makes us rethink some of our assumptions about, like, who was exploring where and when. Like, to really get this whole Spanish-Alaska thing, we've got to rewind a bit, go back to the 18th century.
Okay, so we're talking like powdered wigs, big empires.
Exactly. I think shifting global power dynamics, right?
Yeah.
Spain, even though they were past their, like, peak of power, were still fiercely clinging to that vast empire of theirs.
Oh, yeah, and they really saw the Pacific as their own, didn't they? Like, they literally called it El Lago Español, the Spanish lake. Talk about confidence.
Yeah.
But what was it that made them want to explore and then actually claim those really distant lands?
Okay, so their motivations, they were actually pretty complex, like a real mix of economic ambition, political strategy, and even a sense of religious zeal, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So on one hand, they were totally looking for new trade routes, especially that elusive Northwest Passage, the one that promised a shortcut to Asia and all those riches.
Oh, yeah, the fabled Northwest Passage. Everyone was looking for that.
Exactly. But at the same time, they were also trying to counter the growing influence of their rivals, like England and Russia, who, of course, were also eyeing the Pacific Northwest with, a lot of interest.
I bet it was a prime piece of real estate even back then.
Absolutely. And Spain, because they were already well established in South America, felt like they had to extend their reach north, secure their claim on the Pacific and all the resources that came with it.
So it was like this strategic move.
Exactly.
Protect their interests and keep their spot on that world stage.
You got it.
But did they use the same, large-scale colonization tactics that they were known for in South America?
Not quite. It's interesting. Unlike their huge efforts in South America, the Spanish expeditions to Alaska, they were much smaller.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely more focused on exploration, asserting sovereignty, more about gathering information than anything else.
So more like strategic probes instead of all-out conquest.
You got it. Reconnaissance. They wanted to establish a presence, not necessarily go all in on building a whole bunch of permanent settlements.
Interesting. Okay, so what were their main goals? What were they hoping to achieve?
Okay, so they had 3 primary objectives.
Okay, lay on me.
Number 1, assert Spanish sovereignty over the region.
Makes sense. Plant their flag, so to speak.
Precisely. Number 2, they wanted to meticulously map that very treacherous coastline.
Oh, yeah, I bet those maps were invaluable back then.
Absolutely. And finally, they wanted to keep a very close eye on their competitors, especially those pesky Russians. They were always encroaching on their territory.
Yeah, the Russians were definitely making moves in that direction.
Oh, absolutely. It was a real race for control.
So we're talking about these early expeditions, the ships, the men, facing incredible hardships, navigating uncharted waters. It's hard to imagine how challenging that must have been.
Oh, it was beyond challenging. Imagine yourself on a small wooden ship, constantly tossed about by these ferocious storms. Right. You're navigating through dense fogs, you have limited supplies, and there's this ever-present threat of scurvy.
Oh, scurvy, the silent killer of explorers.
The worst. Their journeys were full of danger and uncertainty constantly. They encountered Native American tribes along the way, some friendly and welcoming, others not so much.
Yeah, I can imagine those encounters could be unpredictable.
Totally. And to give you an idea of how difficult it was, there's actually this one incredible anecdote about a Spanish ship sailing right past San Francisco Bay. Can you believe it?
Wait, what? They missed San Francisco Bay.
They sailed right past it.
How do you...
It was completely shrouded in fog, missed one of the most spectacular natural harbors in the world because they couldn't see it.
It's incredible. You really get a sense of how challenging and unpredictable exploration was back then.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Everything relied on chance encounters and, frankly, the whims of nature.
Wow. But amidst all of these hardships, they still managed to establish some kind of presence, right? They even built forts, didn't they?
They did. They weren't exactly grand fortifications, but they built these really simple, sturdy structures.
What were they built for, mainly?
Mostly for defense against the elements, potential raids, more like outposts on the very edge of this vast, wild territory. Nothing too elaborate.
So it wasn't like they were trying to establish these massive settlements or anything like that?
No, not at all. It was much more about survival and maintaining a foothold than about creating a new Spanish empire up there.
Right, right. Now, speaking of these expeditions, one of our sources mentions a young Spanish lieutenant leading one of the first to reach Alaska.
Oh, yes. Lieutenant Juan José Pérez Hernández. His name kind of gets lost sometimes, overshadowed by those more famous explorers. But his voyage in 1774 was remarkable.
Okay, tell us more.
So he was in command of the frigate Santiago, sailing north from the Spanish base at San Blas in present-day Mexico.
Ambitious.
Very much so. His mission reached 60 degrees north latitude.
Wow, that is dead north. That's a long way up.
Right. A considerable feat in those days, especially considering they were sailing into mostly uncharted waters.
So did they make it?
They did. Despite facing really harsh weather, dwindling supplies, and that constant threat of scurvy, they managed to reach the outer coast of what's now southeast Alaska. That's
amazing. So they were among the first Europeans to lay eyes on that part of the world.
Officially puts them in the Alaska Club, that's for sure. And they did it all with, let's just say, slightly less advanced technology than we have today.
It's a testament to their skill, their determination, their courage. They were really venturing into the unknown.
Absolutely. And they weren't just sailing blindly into the void either. They were encountering people, cultures they'd never seen before.
You're talking about their interactions with the Native Americans.
Exactly. And those encounters could be incredibly diverse, ranging from peaceful trade and cultural exchange to, moments of tension and even conflict.
Were their interactions different from how other colonial powers treated indigenous people?
It's interesting. In this region at this time, Spain's approach to interacting with the indigenous populations was a little different. It wasn't always perfect, but there was definitely a different vibe.
Really? How so?
Well, they were still driven by their ambitions, of course, but they often emphasized establishing friendly relations, respecting local customs, and trying to avoid unnecessary conflict.
So less about immediate conquest and more about strategic alliances.
You could say that. Remember, they were operating with limited resources in a challenging environment. Diplomacy and cooperation just made more sense in that context.
Fascinating. So these early interactions, they were shaped by, what, like a mix of pragmatism, maybe a degree of respect?
I think that's a fair assessment. It's really interesting to see how those dynamics played out in such a remote and demanding part of the world.
It really makes you wonder what their ultimate goal was. Did they try to establish permanent settlements like they did in other parts of the Americas? Missions, maybe?
It's a great question. Their approach in Alaska was definitely more, nuanced. A blend of asserting their presence, yes, but also forging alliances, extending their influence through trade.
And religion.
To a lesser extent, yes. They did establish some missions, tried to convert Native Americans to Catholicism, but those efforts met with mixed results, to say the least.
Yeah, I can imagine. Convincing people who've lived in Alaska for centuries to adopt a whole new religion, that's a tough sell.
It's a tough sell anywhere, let's be honest, but especially in a place like that. But it's important to remember their presence in Alaska, while significant, never reached the same level of permanence or intensity as their endeavors in South America, for example.
Okay, so it was this balancing act.
Exactly.
Asserting their claim, navigating complex relationships with native populations, and of course, contending with those ever-present European rivals. Talk about geopolitical maneuvering.
Oh, absolutely. The stage was set for some serious power plays, and that brings us to a pivotal event that would test Spain's resolve and nearly ignite a war, the Nootka Sound crisis.
Ooh, this is where things get really interesting, but we'll save that juicy bit of history for next time. So we left off with Spain and England, kind of circling each other, tensions rising over this place called Nootka Sound.
Yeah, Nootka Sound.
Which, honestly, on a map, seems like really, really far from anything.
Right, you'd think it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but...
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this seemingly unimportant little trading post
Right.
became a huge flashpoint.
Yeah.
Like it almost started a war between these two massive empires.
It's wild, right?
It is. So, how did we get there? What were the big events that led to this whole, like, powder keg situation?
Okay, so the Nootka Sound crisis, which is what it became known as, it's a really, really good example of how, even when you're fighting over what seems like a totally insignificant corner of the world, things can blow up.
Totally.
Become this huge international incident.
Right.
And Nootka Sound, which is on the western edge of Vancouver Island, it was important to both Spain and England, but for different reasons.
Okay, so strategically important for both, but in different ways. Makes sense.
Exactly. For Spain, it was all about protecting their claim on the Pacific Northwest, making sure nobody messed with their interests down in California.
Protecting their turf, basically.
Exactly. But for the British, it was all about the fur trade. They saw Nootka Sound as this, gateway to expand that lucrative fur trade further into the Pacific.
So both sides saw it as this strategic foothold.
100%.
Which, historically speaking, rarely ends well.
You're telling me. And of course, this all came to a head in 1789 when this Spanish naval officer, Esteban Jose Martinez, he just seizes several British trading vessels.
Whoa, hold up. He just rocks up and takes their ships.
Pretty much. He sails in, takes their ships, and then declares that the entire area belongs to Spain.
Talk about a power move.
Bold move, for sure.
Bold maybe, but also incredibly provocative.
Oh, absolutely. It sent shockwaves across Europe. Word got back to London, and people were furious.
I bet. And the British, they weren't exactly known for backing down from a challenge.
Not at all. If anything, this just made them double down. They saw it as a chance to assert their own dominance, so they demand the return of their ships.
More than just the ships, I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah. They wanted compensation, too. And they made it very, very clear that they were ready to go to war if Spain didn't back down.
So it's a full-blown international standoff now.
High-stakes diplomacy at its finest. The fate of the entire Pacific Northwest hanging in the balance. It was a tense time.
Okay, so what happens? Who blinks first?
Well, Spain's in a tough spot, right? They're already having economic issues back home, and they're starting to realize that they're pretty isolated on the world stage. Plus, their old ally, France.
Yeah, what about them?
They're kind of busy with their own revolution, not exactly in a position to offer much help.
Not the best time to need a favor, I guess.
Nah.
So Spain's basically on their own, facing the full might of the British Empire. What do?
They chose the path of, shall we say, pragmatism.
They caved.
Well, they realized that a war would be incredibly costly, and frankly, they didn't have the resources to keep it up for very long, so they decided to negotiate.
The better part of valor and all that.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
after months and months of this really tense back and forth, in 1790, they signed the Nootka Conventions.
Okay, so these Nootka Conventions, what did they actually say?
Well, it wasn't a complete victory for either side, but it did a few important things. First, it established this idea of free navigation and trade in the Pacific Northwest.
So basically, anyone could sail through and trade there.
Essentially, Spain, Britain, even other countries, they all had the right to explore, trade, even build settlements in the region.
Wow, okay, so not quite El Lago Español anymore.
Yeah.
Did Spain just completely give up their claim to the whole area?
Not entirely. It was a turning point for sure, but they did hold on to some rights. They could keep their settlements south of the region.
Okay.
And they were allowed to build new ones north of California if they wanted to.
So they still had some skin in the game.
They did, but the Nootka Conventions really marked the end of their dominance in the Pacific.
It's interesting how one event in a place that seems so insignificant could shift the balance of power so dramatically.
It really is, and it highlights this global power shift that was happening. Spain's influence is fading, and new players like England and, don't forget about Russia, are starting to make their moves.
Yeah, Russia's always lurking in the background. But let's go back to Spain for a minute. Even though they eventually had to pull back from the region, they didn't leave empty-handed, did they?
Not at all. I mean, think about it. They spent decades exploring, charting those waters, and they were really meticulous record keepers. All those maps, journals, scientific observations, they left behind this incredible treasure trove of knowledge.
So they were explorers, diplomats, and scientists all rolled into one.
Pretty much. And all that information, it gives us this amazing window into what the Pacific Northwest was like before large-scale European colonization.
So, in a way, they were unintentionally creating this time capsule for future generations.
Exactly. And that information is still relevant today.
Really? How so?
It helps scientists track the effects of, like, climate change over time.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, and understand the history of indigenous land use.
Interesting.
It even helps identify potential areas for conservation.
It's amazing to think. So all that data collected centuries ago is still making a difference.
It really is, which I think highlights how important these historical records are for present-day research and conservation. It's a direct link to the past.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive here, what became of Spanish Alaska? I mean, it didn't last. Yeah. But what are the echoes of their presence, the things that we can still see, still feel today?
Well, one of the most obvious legacies is right there on the map, literally.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
All those place names,
okay.
Valdez, Cordova, the Malaspina Glacier, those are all Spanish names.
Oh, wow, you're right.
They're like these little linguistic echoes of a bygone era, these constant reminders of the Spanish explorers who, sailed those waters, explored those coastlines.
And we just drive by them or see them on a map and never really think twice about them.
Exactly. But they're more than just geographical markers. They're like tangible connections to a time when the fate of the Pacific Northwest was still up in the air.
It's true. It's like these names have stories to tell if you know how to listen.
And here's a little historical irony for you. The British explorer George Vancouver, the guy who pretty much charted the whole Pacific Northwest coastline, he relied heavily on, wait for it, Spanish maps.
Get out. Are you serious?
I'm serious. He used their intel to solidify British dominance in the region.
That is incredible.
Talk about poetic justice.
It really is. Yeah. It just goes to show you, history is full of surprises.
And it reminds us that, even when information is gathered for, let's say, strategic purposes, it can have these totally unintended consequences.
It's true. So in a weird way, those early Spanish expeditions, even though they didn't create a lasting Spanish Alaska, they paved the way for the British to come in.
You could definitely argue that.
Wow. This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
I agree.
Before we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the big takeaway here is that history is rarely as straightforward as we think. You have to be willing to dig deeper, to challenge those conventional narratives, and be open to the surprises that are often lurking just below the surface.
So true.
And the story of Spanish Alaska, it reminds us that exploration, it wasn't just about claiming territory or even those geopolitical chess moves. It was also about expanding knowledge, even if it came at a cost.
Yeah, and those costs, those impacts, they're still being felt today.
Yeah.
Which is something to really think about.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this amazing journey into Spanish Alaska. It's been a real eye-opener for me.
It's been my pleasure. Any chance to explore the lesser-known corners of history is a good day for me.
Me too. And I think our listeners would agree. So until next time, keep exploring.